Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our panel on algorithm-based consumer credit, evidence on the impacts in emerging markets. My name is Alex Kessler, and I'm a research manager at the Center for Financial Inclusion. CFI's work supports the development of inclusive finance systems for low-income people around the world through our research and advocacy. For more than a decade, CFI has worked to advance financial inclusion and consumer protection. And we've also particularly focused on what new risks confront low-income consumers as financial services go digital. CFI has also just been awarded a grant from the Capital Consortium to study how capital has spurred the development of digital credit in some markets and how this capital has driven growth and led to unintended consequences. This work will also contribute to developing guardrails for investors and other financial inclusion stakeholders to help shape responsible market development. I'm excited to be facilitating our panel today featuring new findings on the impacts of digital credit through research from the Digital Credit Observatory, or DCO, which is an initiative based at UC Berkeley at their research hub, the Center for Effective Global Action. The DCO was established in 2016 with support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. To date, they've funded 16 studies across 10 countries on 3 different continents, building a portfolio of rigorous research on the impacts of digital credit products in low and middle income countries. Today, we'll hear an update on a forthcoming research synthesis paper and the specific results from 3 completed impact evaluations. Personally, I've been very eager to hear the results of these studies, as the inclusive finance sector has grown concerned with the effects that digital credit may be having or not having on the lives of low-income men and women. Digital credit uses newly available, usually mobile data to power algorithms that make near-instant credit decisions, generally of small dollar amounts, with short repayment windows and correspondingly high interest rates. It promises to extend access to credit to people previously excluded for lack of data or being too difficult to reach, and may contribute to consumption smoothing and greater resilience. But at what cost, we're not sure. There are also reasons to worry that this instant source of credit can lead to debt stress or other negative consequences for low-income consumers. Another concern is how these new digital financial products might be shaping the data trails of consumers in ways that could cement financial exclusion. These studies are starting to fill in a number of these gaps on the impact of digital credit, some with immediate product design and policy repercussions, and all with implications for shaping the next phase of research. Now I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. First is John Robinson, professor of economics at the University of Santa Cruz. He is a development economist and mostly runs projects that are field experiments in rural Africa. His recent research focuses on market access for farmers and at evaluating the effect of financial access. He's also the co-scientific director of the Digital Credit Observatory. Mike Kuhn is an associate professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Oregon. He is an applied behavioral economist with an interest in applications to consumer finance, public economics, and labor economics. His work uses a variety of methods, laboratory experiments, field experiments, and observational data analysis to study the importance of behavioral theory for economic policy, the determinants of preferences, and preference elicitation methodology. And Shema is a PhD candidate at Syracuse University's School of Information Studies. His research investigates the use of technology in developing countries. He's particularly interested in using novel data, such as those generated by the use of mobile phones, to understand socioeconomic lives of people in underserved areas. His current projects explore mechanisms of reducing the high default rates observed in the digital microlending industry. So before I hand the reins to John, just a few housekeeping items. Please feel free to post in the chat and the Q&A throughout the discussion. We'll be monitoring for those questions, and we've held time to answer them at the end of the session. So John, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. I can't see you as I do this, so just let me know if there's any problem. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present.
Sorry, John, before you dive in, I think we're just seeing the full set of slides rather than an individual slide at the moment.
Okay. Sorry. Does that work?
We're getting the same view still.
Try again. Is that better or no?
No, it's the same, the view again.
Maybe should we, yeah, I don't know. Should we go ahead.
I was gonna say, if you're presenting, maybe take it out of presentation mode and just go through with them on the scrolling through. That might work.
Okay. Sorry.
No problem. We can also maybe move to.
We could have someone else go first.
Yeah,
maybe.
that can work. If Mike, are you ready to talk about your study next, and then we'll circle back?
Yeah, I'll give it a try. Hopefully, we don't have the same issue, but sure, happy to.
Thanks.
Let's see. All right, are we looking good?
Yes.
All right. Phew. Okay, so it's an absolute pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you about our work this morning. So I'm Michael Kuhn. I'm from the University of Oregon. This is joint work with Alfredo Burlando and Sylvia Prina, and we're talking today about digital credit delivery speed and repayment rates of that credit. So I want to start by just showing you the typical ad you might encounter for an online loan in Latin America. And you can see front and center advertised here is the speed with which the loan will be delivered. That first big line says your loan online in 5 minutes. And you could look across other Latin American markets, across other lenders, and you'll see very similar advertisements. It's clear that these companies are competing on a perceived really strong demand for speed by consumers in that market. But on the other hand, we're not sure that speed is a direct goal of digital credit innovation. We think it's almost a byproduct of other technological innovations that have permitted really, really fast credit. So the access to digital financial tools on your mobile phone or on the internet means that loans deposited into digital financial accounts can then be used really quickly. That means that there is a demand for fast credit because that credit can be used quickly. Algorithmic scoring is another technology that is labor saving. It has other advantages, but because then it's automated and it works so quickly, it creates the opportunity to provide credit a lot more quickly than would have been possible in the past with an individual scoring credit. So we end up with these innovations that allow us to provide credit a lot more quickly in a lot more settings than we had before. But we don't know the effect of creditor speed in this market. And that's either relative to the speed of traditional credit, nor are there good estimates within the traditional credit market of the impacts of creditor speed. While there is some work on the speed with which borrowers choose to request loans, this is really, I think, an open question and one we'd like to try and address with this paper. So our goal is to identify a causal impact of digital credit provision speed on default. I'll refer to it as repayment. I'll show you the repayment rates going forward, so the inverse of default. But we're interested in this causal relationship. Our approach is to partner with a Mexican digital lender. We're going to observe their full set of first, second, and third time borrowers over a 7-month horizon. And that's from 2018 to 2019. So this is all pre-pandemic data. The reason I point out that we're seeing different types of borrowers, first, second, and third time, is because there's going to be an important distinction between first-time borrowers and repeat borrowers that I'll draw later. We have limited observable data on these folks. We know their loan amounts and durations for their first loans. For all loans, we know the repayment status and due date. We have a limited set of observables collected by the lender to aid in their credit scoring. Our main sort of innovation is that we're going to leverage the batch processing of approved loans to construct a regression discontinuity design that allows us to estimate the effective interest. Let me run you through really quickly the loan disbursement process to help you try and understand how we're getting our estimates here. In a single online session, borrowers choose a loan amount, duration, submit their application, and then they're automatically scored and notified of approval in that online session. They may also be notified of rejection, but then they wouldn't be in our sample here. So that's in a single online session, the loan is approved. If you are a first-time borrower, your loan then has to be verified using a telephone call to verify identity. That can take a while depending on call center availability and whether people pick up. But after verification or right after approval for repeat loans, loans are added to an open batch of verified loans. Think of that as just like an Excel spreadsheet with all the verified, ready-to-go loans that has not yet been sent to the bank. Eventually, though, once that queue gets full enough, the lender will transmit that batch to the bank, and all of the loans in the batch are dispersed simultaneously. So our source of identification is that batching process. Is the loan the last line in that Excel spreadsheet of approved and verified loans, the last loan to make it into a batch? Or did it just miss the cutoff, and does it form the first row of a new spreadsheet? And is thus going to have to wait for all the other lines to fill up before it's sent to the bank? That's where we're going to identify the effect of the speed of the loan. There are a lot of quirks and difficulties with doing that I don't have time to get into today, but I'd be happy to talk about that in more detail or answer any questions you have about it. Let me show you our results from this exercise. So the first thing that I need to show you is that missing that batch cutoff really matters for loan disbursement time. And we're measuring loan disbursement time here in terms of how long it takes in hours from the moment it was approved in that first online session to when the money is in the bank account. For the full sample, we're going from about 10 hours to 19 hours, so nearly a doubling in disbursement time for the typical loan that misses a batch cutoff. But importantly, this is a much sort of more important change for repeat borrowers than first-time borrowers, because repeat borrowers who don't need that verification go from a pretty quick loan to a loan that takes about half a day, a 220% increase in their waiting time, whereas the percentage increase in waiting time for first-time borrowers is lower, and their delay, even with hitting the getting in before the cutoff, is substantial. What that means for our results is that we're going to see a stronger effect of missing the batch cutoff on increasing on loan repayment rates for those repeat borrowers. And they're sort of the folks for whom I think the source of identification is best. For those folks with just making it into the batch cutoff and getting their loan really quickly, we observe a 74% repayment rate. But we see a 10% increase if they're missing the batch cutoff and having to wait longer, for about an 81% repayment rate. So there's about a 10% increase in the repayment rate for those repeat borrowers. So what's going on? Just sort of my one sentence summary of what happens here is that we see that a delay in the disbursement of already approved loans leads to an increase in repayment. Why this happens is extremely hard and something we're working on actively and would love feedback on. It's hard for us to really narrow down because we have very limited data on borrowers. I can tell you one thing that's not going on, and that's that folks are not sort of immediately regretting their decision and choosing to cancel their loans during the delay. Turns out that's actually quite a difficult process. They've already signed up for this money, and it's on its way. It's actually much easier to just take the money and immediately repay it, but we see no evidence of that either. So we think what that means is the delay must affect what the loan is or isn't used for, and that effect must be time sensitive. The two main mechanisms that we have in mind are either a mechanical mechanism wherein a time sensitive investment or consumption opportunity is just missed because of that delay, or a model in which that extra delay allows people more time to think about what they might want to do with the loan before they can actually do so. There's a literature on that. Interestingly, that effect could operate through shifting choices from the individual level to the household level, and we see evidence that the effect is larger for married borrowers consistent with that. So I just have 2 slides left on lessons, and then I'm all done. I do want to emphasize that for borrowers, we don't know enough to say whether the delay was a good or bad thing for their welfare. It could be that an important medical need went unmet, and that's definitely a problem. an urgent medical need, or it could be that the delay diverted the loan out of a wager, which perhaps a long-run self rather than a short-run self might really value. There's a clear pro, which is that we see higher repayment, and that confers access to future credit. That's good. But the bad is that the delay can weakly decrease the short-run value of the credit, and the policymaker or the long-run self may or may not agree with the short-run self about which of those two things weigh out. So which way those weigh out. So any thought about waiting periods as a consumer protection measure depends on more information about this particular trade-off. For lenders, though, it looks like we're seeing increased revenue at quite a limited short-run cost. Any concerns about the cost of this policy to the lender are going to be about reduced demand. Conditional on repayment, though, we see no effect of a delay on the likelihood of customers taking future loans, although there's a slight identification hiccup with that. But in a market that's clearly competing on speed, perhaps it is a long-term concern for lenders to delay their loans in order to increase revenue. I do think this is news to lenders we've talked about, and I wonder if there's a possibility for voluntary delays as scoring or sorting devices that might allow lenders a little bit more flexibility in terms of the types of credit they offer to different folks with different demand speeds in the market. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Great, thanks for that, Mike. And John, should we move to you, or Alan, are you ready to present?
Hi, that works for me.
Okay, great. Thanks, Alan.
Right, I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully this works best. So, can you see it?
Yes, thanks.
Great. Just get them. Right, hello everyone. Thank you for the opportunity, to speak to all of you about my recent research on credit limit. So in this talk, I'll briefly present the results of my study that's tried to understand the effects of increasing credit limits in the digital microlending industry. I'm going to start with the motivation behind the study, and then I'll proceed with the results. Right. So the scarcity of income data in many developing countries means that lenders have they struggle very much to estimate how much they can lend to a person without over-indebting them. Right. So after the initial, the practice is that after the initial screening or credit scoring, they will start by lending a small amount, and then this amount is going to be gradually increased based on repayments. However, from the research in the credit card industry, we know that increasing credit limits can lead to over-indebtedness. It seems that people use their credit card limits as an indication of their future income. So what this means is that the higher a credit limit is, the more the person thinks they're going to be making more money in the future. As a result, people tend to borrow more in response to an increase in credit limits, with expectation that with a future increased income, they'll be able to repay this. However, when it comes to the microfinance industry, whether digital or otherwise, we know very little about what happens when credit limits are increased. So in this study, I wanted to explore the loan outcomes when credit limits are changed, particularly when they increased. In addition, I also wanted to explore whether there were pre-existing differences between the borrowers that sort of affect the outcome that we may observe later on in the study. And the reason for this is that if we know, if we have some indication of what might happen before the loans are dispersed, then maybe lenders could do something about it. Right. For this study, I partnered with an airtime lender that operates across multiple countries in Africa and the Middle East. As some of you may know, 95% of mobile phone subscribers in Africa are what are called prepaid customers. So what this means in practice is that they have to load their phone accounts with airtime and they don't get monthly phone bills like would be the case in many developed countries. So to load airtime, which is also known as recharging your phone, a mobile phone subscriber will go to a shop like the one in the picture, and they will buy a voucher card. These scratch cards contain hidden codes that the person can dial on their phone, and as a consequence, they'll get airtime on their phone. I just wanted to also say that recently we're seeing telecommunication companies phasing out these scratch cards in favor of more electronic transfers of airtime. But the idea is still the same. So what happens when you cannot go to buy airtime because it's inconvenience or for lack of money? The borrower I worked with comes in and allows people to borrow money, which lets them communicate when they can't make these purchases. And the repayments for the loans are done automatically when the borrower recharges their accounts. Right. So in this study, I tried to mimic the actual practices from lenders when it comes to increasing credit limits. The new credit limits were based on past behavior, past repayments behavior, as well as the total amounts that the people were taking prior to the beginning of the experiment. So as a result of this, it was that people who got an increase in their credit limits were those who had displayed, displayed a good repayment pattern in the past, as well as had an appetite for borrowing. The participants for this study, for this experiment, were selected among mobile phone users in a small East African country. Of those who qualified for a credit increase, we randomly selected close to 30,000 participants and increased their credit limits. We also had another group of close to 14,000 participants who had their credit limit frozen, and this was as one of the control groups. In total, I had 3 control groups to isolate the effects of increasing credit limits from other possible factors that might impact repayments. You can find more details of that in the paper. The median credit limit increase was 50%, and the experiments lasted for about 8 months from August 2019 to March 2020. Right. So what happened when we increased the credit limits? In this graph and the subsequent one, the x-axis represents single months during the experiment period, and the y-axis represents the change compared to the corresponding control groups. So in this particular graph, you can see that when we increased the credit limits, people responded immediately by increasing their borrowing. However, you can see also that the increase in borrowing was only temporary and was followed by a steep decrease in the loan amount. So what could be happening? At first, my thought was that perhaps there was an unmet need for more airtime. That is, people were borrowing more to increase their communication than they were otherwise doing before. But you can see in this graph that the amount of airtime spent on the network actually gradually decreased. So it appears that increasing credit limits negatively impacts people's communication via mobile phones. You can see that the amount of airtime gradually decreasing throughout the experiment period by about 10 percentage points. In fact, it appears that for some people with increased credit limits, what happens is that they lower the purchase of airtime and instead start to use loans as a substitute to actually buying airtime. So this has the consequence of increasing the default rates, and in fact, a number of our participants left the network with unpaid loans. So that means they stopped using their mobile phones altogether. However, we also noticed that not everyone was affected the same way. So people who had longer borrowing history, they were less likely to incur higher loans defaults, as were those who had a track records of timely payments. So people who had been consistently paying back their loans on time previously before the study, the experiments, they were more likely to continue paying. So even with the credit increase. The other factor that we see is that the rate of credit limit increase also influenced the observed outcome, which is people, when you increase the credit limit by a large factor, that tends to lead to more defaults. So in this study, credit limits were increased. We increased the credit limits based on previous loan amounts as well as the repayment behavior. However, people still struggle to pay back larger loans, even as they were previously making timely payments on smaller ones. So some people it appears that some people viewed loans as an alternative to purchasing airtime, as I mentioned, and not as an emergency tool to use in case one cannot load airtime for either convenience or lack of funds. So it means that large loans could possibly be locking people out of future borrowing as they default and are not able to go back. And we know this is also happening where some lenders actually report defaulters to the credit bureaus, meaning that a lot of folks are locked out of future borrowing from multiple other lenders in the future. So besides borrowing experience, we also find that how long a person has been using a product matters in their behavior for repayment. This is especially true for products where, such as solar kits that are given out on loans. The longer a person has been using the products, the more they tend to rely on it, and that means the more they value the use of that product and are willing to pay back the loans. Finally, in this study, we showed that what happens when we increase credit limits. However, to get a fuller picture, there is needs to look at the perspective of borrowers to understand how credit limits change their previous payments behavior. So, like I mentioned, we increased the credit limits based on previous borrowing. So these people were already able to pay back these amounts. It's just like now that's where they were able to borrow at once. That seemed to have changed the outcome. Thank you very much, and I'll welcome any question afterwards.
Great, thanks for that, Alan. And this theme of understanding the consumer's perspective is coming through these presentations, so I'm sure we'll get into that in the discussion. John, over to you. Let me know.
All right, let's try it. Try to switch to PDF. Does that work? Yes,
we can see it. Great.
Okay, thank you. Just let me know if there are further issues. Thank you for your patience. As was mentioned before, my name is John Robinson. I'm a co-director of the Digital Credit Observatory at CEGA. And some of these slides would have made a little bit more sense 15 minutes ago, but at CEGA, we've been studying digital credit, and as has been coined by others, digital credit is differentiated from traditional credit by being instant, automated, and remote, meaning that that loans are revolutionary in a way, in the sense that they can be dispersed immediately without any interaction with a human, and can be immediately accessed anywhere in the world without any transaction or very minimal transaction costs. And so at the Digital Credit Observatory, we've been studying this issue and looking at the state of the world as it currently stands. So there are a number of different types of digital credit products that exist. The ones that were mentioned are both good examples. We have products that, especially in Africa, are credit products between banks and telcos, which is similar to the previous presentation, but are not for airtime, but for digital credit, and are backed by a bank. There are some that are smartphone apps that might be backed by a bank, but are on an app. There are some that don't have any bank backing, and then there's the airtime loans, like the previous presentation. So probably don't have a lot of time to get into this, but digital credit has exploded in popularity throughout the world. So the area that I'm most familiar with is in Africa, where especially in East Africa, tens of millions of people have taken out loans. Estimates have shown in early adopter countries like Kenya, that there's 10 digital loans for every traditional loan at this point. And that data was even from a few years ago. So I'm sorry that this is a little bit small, but the question the Digital Credit Observatory was tasked with is that, as was mentioned at the beginning, is that while there's a lot of promising rhetoric around digital credit, and while the technology has a lot of potential, the reality is that most of the products that are currently offered are expensive and short-term loans with interest rates well over 100% APR, and many times well over 100%. In general, there's a lot of evidence that people are not very informed of the loan terms that they're signing up for, and default is common. And so the question is digital credit helpful or harmful? And it's not obvious that it would be helpful. I think a lot of people have more of a prior that it might be harmful, but a lot of that evidence is also anecdotal. So the Digital Credit Observatory, which was started in 2016, has funded about 15 projects or so. And not every one of these worked out, because these are collaborations with a partner. And there are various reasons why not every project worked out. But nevertheless, there was a number of successful projects that did have results. We have about 9 of them so far, and we're working on a synthesis document that we hope to have in the coming weeks. We have 4 products. These are, so the synthesis does not include only CEGA funded projects, but we have 4 products that are bank telco initiatives in Africa, and we find just consistent with what everyone already knows is the interest rate is extremely high, but yet take-up, one of the interesting things that we find here is just the take-up is very high as well. So I think we probably knew that already from the millions of people who take it out, but using the designs that we have, we find that, a third or more of people are willing to take out loans at these very high interest rates, which itself is interesting and suggestive that access to credit is really limited. We have another 5 evaluations that are about non-bank products, which are a range of products, including the 2 that were just mentioned. And again, those find quite high take-up rates as well, depending on the design. In general, these products are popular. What is the impact? That's something we don't have as much evidence on, because many of the projects weren't designed around that. And the challenges I mentioned before limit the ability of every project to show that. But there are 3 main studies so far that have shown impacts. There's Tavneet Suri et al., who studied the Mshwari product in Kenya. Josh Blumenstock et al., actually that's Bjorkgren et al., I believe, but Josh Blumenstock, the other co-director of CEGA, has a project about a smartphone app in Nigeria. And then my own project, Bralovskaya et al., which is a bank telco project in Malawi. And these tend to be, the general design is either a randomized controlled trial like the previous study, or a regression discontinuity comparing people just above a credit threshold to people just below. And in general, perhaps surprisingly, these do not find, the evidence so far is modestly positive, and there's been no evidence necessarily of big negative effects. The Blumenstock et al. And Bralovskaya et al. Find modest effects on financial well-being, nothing too big or too small. The previous study, the Suri et al. One, showed effects on risk sharing or coping with unexpected shocks. So these don't necessarily ring big alarm bells so far, though the major caveat is that these projects are, fairly small loans. These are with accredited lenders. These are probably not the worst of digital credit, but nevertheless, they, on the whole, don't show anything too negative. But what I will talk about with the remaining couple of minutes is just from our own study in Malawi, just to talk about one major caveat, which is lack of information from borrowers. So I think this is something that's commonly known. It's not necessarily as documented as one would think. So there's definitely a number of studies that speak to this, but I think that we hopefully can add to this debate as well. So in our study in Malawi, we find one fact is that the product is really only profitable because people pay back late. So there's only about 10 or 15% of people who don't pay back loans at all. But of those who do, most of them are paying late. And then they end up paying really substantial late fees on this particular project, which is with Airtel Malawi. And so people who are paying back late are paying interest rates that are 26% when the actual loan term is 10%. When you ask them just basic questions about when the loan is due, what the interest rate is, so forth, they don't, whether there are late fees, about 1/3 of people are aware of these things. So what we did is something that would be an obvious intervention, which is to intervene to provide information to people about the costs of digital credit. So this was done through an interactive voice response module, and we were able to get actually quite high take-up from incentivizing people and really actively encouraging them to take up the module. And the IVR module was an anecdote of a store owner who was buying inventory. And we went through, first of all, just informing people of the interest rate, the late fees, informing them that terms change. And that happened during our project, that late fees were increased. And we did emphasize that there's going to be, the default cost could include being reported to a credit bureau, but also being barred from future loans. Things along those lines, and did suggest possibly using savings instead. And what we find was really extremely surprising to us, which is that while we did not directly state whether Kuchova was the product Kuchova was a good or a bad investment decision, I think our overall interpretation was that people might think that that the costs were really high, and yet what happened is loan demand actually increased. And then surprisingly to us, anecdotally, people said that going through this calculation actually made them think that the product was less expensive than they thought. So with other digging around in the data, we do find that the interest rates that people pay on other sources is extremely high. So perhaps it's not as surprising, but this is not what we were expecting to find. We found that this actually increases repayment a bit, though. So people are less likely to be late on a given loan. But a countervailing force is because they're more likely to take out loans, they take out more. And so therefore they have more chances to default. And in the end, we're actually more likely to default, even though on any individual loan, it was less so. On at least one loan, it was more so. So just to conclude here, our study shows that that impacts seem to be positive, but on the other hand, the ingredients for predatory lending are definitely there in the sense that people have very high demand for credit, even at very high interest rates. They're not informed. Most people are not informed, and the terms are not clearly disclosed. So while the effects are modest, we do definitely caution against about overinterpreting that because there's an opportunity there for a lender to take advantage of this consumer misinformation. The last thing we'll conclude with is that this is all the more so just in the sense that while digital credit has such potential, the products that are being offered are really focusing on short-term high interest rate loans, and those can only have modest effects anyway because they can't be used for a lot of investments like farming or education or things like that. So while we don't really have a lot of evidence one way or the other about major effects, we do definitely think that future research should definitely focus on the financial literacy and consumer protection part of the digital credit market. So thank you. Back to you.
Great. Thanks for that recap of the number of different studies and the range of work that this is going to synthesize this paper. And just to start off our discussion, going back to some of the findings that there were not many of the studies detected any significant negative effects of digital credit, but they did reveal risks. So the risks you're talking about in terms of understanding loan terms and fees. I'd just love to dig in a little bit more about, is digital credit maybe safer than some people expected, or is this maybe a function of some of the consumer segments that are accessing these loans that might be more urban, educated, better resourced? How should we be thinking about the risks that these studies did reveal in terms of the most low-income, vulnerable segments that might be accessing this product? Maybe, John, we can start with your thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, it's a complicated question because the people who are eligible for, speaking of my own study in Malawi, the people who are eligible for those loans are the creme de la creme of society. So that when we were randomly cold calling people, but employees at the enumeration firm would be among that group. It was only tens of thousands of people that were eligible. So one could. So I think a key question is whether loans are being reported to a credit bureau, and in terms of assessing harm. And according to our partner, they do threaten people with that, but then ultimately say that they don't actually report. Whereas in Kenya, we have a much different story. So I think it's complicated because on the one way of looking, when you present this to an economist, if there's no penalty for non-repayment and you can just take the small amount of loan and just walk away with it, the economist would say that's the smart thing to do. So it's just a question of, it's not really clear what the consequences are. And I think it varies dramatically across different settings. Like if you were to, these stories that have come out about, repayment, the aggressive repayment of digital lending labs in India and that sort of thing, that's not the context we were studying.
Definitely. I know, Mike or Alan, if you have thoughts on that question. I think Another question too. So just I saw in the chat, this might be a follow-up from our audience on John, your presentation, but one of our audience members is asking if you could recap some of the examples of non-bank models, and have these been found to be more risky and or create less welfare than bank models. And so I think that speaks to some of these other studies included in our presentation today of the non-bank models.
Yes, I think the classic example of the non-bank model is an app developed in Silicon Valley, California, that is backed by investors and is just directly installed on people's smartphones. And so there are a number of those sorts of apps that typically requires people to have a smartphone, and so that's the standard. There are several of those in countries like Kenya, but then globally, I think that's a dominant way of lending in Asia, for example, or I think that's the story of the digital lending issues that happen in India, is my understanding. So I think it could be much riskier, or I think it depends on the context, but certainly some of the worst examples were of that sort. So I think the risk point is well taken.
I can jump in a tiny bit there. I mean, in Latin America, that's certainly the dominant model. And I think there are two forces cutting against one another there. I think where that's the dominant model, you see deeper, more competitive markets. And when we were surveying the landscape to get an idea of what was going on with this lender, we certainly found that was the case, that there was a lot of options available in this space. The competition there does not seem to benefit the consumer on a price level, or at least I guess I can't say that, but the competition doesn't bring those APRs down into the range that we as economists are comfortable with. You see that competition being good for consumers if they have a fast demand for credit. It seems like that's the dimension that competitive forces are pushing. But interestingly, it doesn't seem like those non-bank models are pushing these competitive markets towards lower rates. It's about accessing, riskier and riskier elements of the population, which is good from an inclusion point of view. But again, there are potential downsides associated with that. So I think that's been my main experience, is comparing what we've seen to the other papers I'm consuming on this topic, is that we have this sort of deep competitive markets, but it's not necessarily pushing the market towards dimensions that we can say are unambiguously good for consumers. Instead, we're going in a direction with more ambiguity, potential benefits, as well as potential costs in those non-bank models.
So just building off of that, with that direction of ambiguity you're describing, Mike, from what you've all learned in the studies you've engaged in and seen across the new studies that are coming out, what would be one or two changes you would say, either from a product design perspective or from a policy perspective? We've talked a little bit on financial capability, on those types of interventions. What would you like to see providers or regulators focus on next to make this more beneficial and kind of move in that direction away from this ambiguity? I think we could hear from each of you on that.
I'll jump in just because I'm thinking about it right now after having making the last point. I think for me, because we have so much ambiguity about consumer welfare in our study, I think a lot about what the lenders can do based on this. And I think I would really love to see lenders do more asking the question to consumers, when do you need this money? Because I think asking that question allows for some potentially mutually beneficial sorting amongst borrowers that need loans on different timeframes. If I only value the money if I need it right away, perhaps that lets, I may have been quite a risky bet, but if I need the money right away, perhaps I'm willing to pay an interest rate that above what's being offered. And I might not have had access to that without letting the company know that I had a really short time frame. The flip side of that is if I say, I actually don't need this money until next week, I may be, I could be offered a lower price. You could keep me away from one of your competitors or something like that by screening me on that slower demand. So I sort of think the one unambiguous thing you get from our paper is that at the individual level, or I think the thing you get from our paper at a lender level is that there are probably there's an unserved segment of the population out there that is more profitable than you think for slower loans. And if you add some sort of screening device into your application, you could potentially both increase revenue by serving a larger fraction of the population and increase revenue by getting a higher repayment rate on properly screened, slowed down loans. And so I think competing on speed is one thing, and maybe you can't give that up because you can't lose out to your competitors, but allowing for flexibility along that dimension from your consumers might be really helpful for both sides of the market.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think that might also connect to some of the ideas of adding friction in. This is, a sorting of customers, but some other ways that more deliberation can happen depending on the type of customer that's coming to the product. And Alan, I don't know if you want to add your thoughts next on what changes either at the product or policy level are arising out of your research findings.
Yeah, I think one thing that I learned from this study, and as well as other things interacting with the lenders there, is people need time to adjust to this new lending through mobile phones and digital lending. A lot of folks, which goes back to the previous question, is there's been a lot of people borrowing without just because they can. I have in my phone and I get this SMS as a promotion saying you can get a loan quickly, blah, 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 you qualify for this, and immediately people borrow. And then sometimes they will end up in this cycle of borrowing from different apps to pay the previous loans, and I've definitely seen some of that. So I think going back to like policy interventions and things like it, people needs time, and maybe starting with smaller loans. And sharing information across different lenders so that people know who owes who what, because that is still very fragmented, at least in a number of African countries I know of. Yeah.
So you're talking a little bit about the loan stacking issue and how that is increasing people's debt burdens, but the lenders might not have that awareness of how many loans an individual has taken out, depending on the context in that country, if it's, there's reporting or no reporting. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. So I think some lenders in Kenya, they started, they report people to the credit bureaus, but the way credit bureaus operate in a number of countries, like speaking of my own country, Rwanda, it tends to be a very slow process. So because they were mostly created for banks, which take time to process your loan so they can make the checks with the credit bureau. When you're talking about fast loans, it's really difficult. They seem to not be adapted to this kind of lending. So creating some type of platform where information can quickly be reported and quickly be retrieved at the time of lending, I think it will definitely benefit this type of loans. And also, like the thing I was talking about, the experience is, one way that lenders look at experience is by the number of loans. So what they will do is that they'll start with a small loan, and then if you pay that back immediately, you get a bump in the credit limit. You pay that immediately, and so you end up with this practice that's been called spinning, which is people borrowing multiple times to get their credit limit increased, and that is, I think it's the wrong way to look at it from my perspective. Is people need time. They need time to know that this is a loan, even if I get it from my phone without speaking to a person. So there's this lack of accountability to a credit officer in front of you. And also the fact that you're getting it so quickly, maybe, doesn't give you enough time to sort of plan for it and feel the need for it. I think people need time to build up experience of using these loans and paying back. Yeah.
So that definitely connects to a product feature, that the way the lenders are designing these products to allow for that graduation, and maybe the sequencing of that or the way that's done needs more attention. And over to you, John, thinking through what product or policy changes you think are arising from your work.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, these are some good points raised. For us, really on the top of our mind is just that in the data we were just analyzing, we observed that late fees were higher than were officially announced in terms and conditions. And so I think just first and foremost, like really basic mandatory disclosure laws and really basic consumer protection changes have to be in there. Just so the level of knowledge of loan terms is really shockingly low. So I think everyone knew that not people don't necessarily know every detail about the loans they're taking out. But I just think that, and our survey was just one. It's just one attempt at it. I'm sure that there could be additional, more thought through ways of measuring exactly what they know, but it just from such a low level, and people are so desperate for credit that I think that's the number one thing. And then on top of that, as someone who works in agriculture, most of my research is really with farmers and rural households, is that these loans are obviously not going to be really beneficial to those individuals. And so for farmers, some of the reduction in transaction costs, like the distance to the bank or intermediation of the loan officer, are the main things, but the needing it instantly is actually not necessarily a big part of it. So I think there's not necessarily a big market for serving farmers. I've spoken to a couple of lenders who are doing that, and the DCO did have a couple of projects that were targeted towards farmers, but they didn't totally work out. I think it just, unless the market changes such that there are products like that, there's only so much you can expect is going to happen from taking out loans that have a 15% interest rate due in 2 weeks.
And that's such an interesting point that we're also just talking basic consumer protection measures that may not be in place depending on how these products fall in categorized in different markets. So they may be totally unregulated in a number of places, though that regulation is starting to shift. So just disclosure, that type of consumer protection measure that is well known in the banking sector just needs to be more widely applied. So in all these studies too, I know we've used a variety of methods and data sources to understand the impacts of these products. And one thing that did come up in the earlier presentations was a need to understand this consumer perspective a little bit more deeply. So maybe the whys behind their taking out these loans or some of their decisions. And I was wondering if you all could speak to some other data sources or research methodologies that you think would be useful in pushing this research further, especially to get into some of the more gender differentiated impacts. I know some of the studies do speak to gender differences, but that's another area where just different methodologies or data could be useful to understand that further. Maybe Mike, do you want to jump in first if you have thoughts there? Thanks.
I can talk about it. Sure. I mean, you mentioned gender differences. I didn't talk about it today. We do see that the most affected group in our sample seems to be married women. We don't have a story for that. And I think that links back to we maybe have a story for why being married matters, but we certainly don't have a story about why women are more affected. I think that comes back to the fact that we're working with this extraordinarily limited set of observables that the creditor collects. So in Mexico there is linkage to credit bureaus, but we really poorly understand, and it seems the lender really poorly understands exactly what incentives the consumers face with that credit bureau. And so we really tried to establish the connections that would allow us to link our data to credit bureau data to follow these individuals over a longer term forward, and also look further back in their financial past and sort of see how long have these individuals had formal credit scores. Are they coming to these loans from a position of some financial experience? Is this their first experience? And so for us, we really thought that linkage would have been incredibly valuable for us, and we weren't able to get it. And so I think in places where there are formal credit bureaus, but like John said, economists not understanding the incentives that consumers face in light of those credit bureaus make it really hard to interpret the costs of default. So I think from a data point of view going forward, I think studies that can get that linkage and understand what the long-term consequences are and the long-term behavioral impacts of not getting access or just barely getting access to those loans is going to be crucial.
Great. Alan or John, thoughts to add?
I don't mean to jump the queue. I can step in though. Yeah, I think these are some great questions. I mean, I think that the tricky, so the studies that have been done within the DCO, like, were really survey-based measures trying to look at the impacts. And I think the tricky thing is, how can you really tell what happened to people without some measure like that? So we, in our study, we have access to this enormous database of mobile money transactions and digital credit transactions, but there are certainly things you can learn from this, but it's hard without some other interaction or other data source from the borrowers. And so I think that's the really tricky thing. I think something that would be very valuable, like from my own perspective, would be to do more consumer surveys, understanding what they know when they take out loans, or the questions about loan purposes, I think, is a really good one that would be. So I think there's a lot that's been learned, has already been learned, and could be learned more, could be learned from those sorts of surveys. When you speak about the gender differences, like in our own Malawi data, because we have the universe of transactions, we do see these enormous gaps, that, mind-blowing gap in access to mobile money. There's a 20 percentage point difference in access among men and women, which goes into digital credit as well. But then you can do a lot of that with this administrative data, but then going beyond that is where you get stuck. So I think kind of like rapid, smaller surveys would be very useful for future research, because as opposed to these very involved, like detailed, end-line surveys that we did.
Do you think, I know the Malawi study used interactive voice recording technologies, the IVR technology, for some of the financial literacy work. Do you think there's directions like that, tools like that, that would be useful for the type of studies you're describing, or are there challenges associated with those?
No, that's a good point. That's a good thought. Yeah, we were able to get so essentially there was an amount of compensation, which was less than $1 that we paid for people, and we just people get a lot of stuff on their phone, but I guess it's not as much as in other contexts. And if you just repeatedly ask them and make it very clear that if they do this, they'll get a small amount of compensation, it works. So I think that's a great idea, because the cost is just getting them on the phone.
Great. And Alan, do you have thoughts to add on this question?
Yeah, I wonder also if part of the way you get feedback from users is also dependent on the partner that you have. Like in my case, when I'm speaking with the airtime lender, the end user does not know of their existence. What they know is that they're dealing with a telecommunication company, and so when there is a default, the lender has to pay back the telecommunication company. And so in that sense, that the telco does not have any incentive to speak to borrowers in that sense. And so I tried to push them for some kind of dialogues with end users, but they were saying, it's really difficult, because it's difficult to push the telco that has nothing to gain and nothing to lose from that, for establishing that kind of infrastructure. So I think there's, it can be quite tricky when the incentives do not always align to do more in-depth interviews and surveys.
Yeah, so that infrastructure for feedback, or even collecting loan purpose when a lender is giving out a loan, that type of, from the provider angle, that's also something that they're not doing or have no incentive necessarily to do, which would be the type of data that would fill some of these gaps potentially. Great. Well, I just, we're at our final minute in this session. So I wanted to say my thanks to you all for preparing these presentations and for the thoughtful discussion. It's been a pleasure to moderate this conversation. And I really look forward to seeing how we can continue to fill the gaps on this research and see the synthesis paper that's going to be released, and all the research from the forthcoming research from this group. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a great opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Take care and enjoy the rest of the summit. To our audience, it's been a great week and more of sessions. So have a good day, and thanks for joining. Bye.